The most revealing part of this shutdown fight is not that TSA workers were dragged into it. It's that Donald Trump just moved to pay them anyway. Think about what that means for a second. Congress is still deadlocked over Homeland Security funding, the House and Senate are still fighting over ICE and border enforcement, and yet, the White House has now stepped in to shield one of the most visible pressure points in the entire standoff: airport security. That is not a small detail, that is the center of the story. Because once TSA workers get protected while the rest of the fight continues, this stops being just a shutdown story, it becomes a story about political strategy, and if you stay to the end, the key thing to understand is this: Trump may not be trying to end the crisis yet, he may be trying to control which parts of the crisis voters actually feel. That is why this matters right now. On the surface, this sounds simple. TSA officers are considered essential workers. They still have to show up, they still have to screen passengers, they still have to keep airports running. But during a shutdown fight, that usually means they can be forced to work while pay gets delayed or thrown into chaos. That is exactly the kind of story that becomes politically dangerous very fast. Long security lines are visible, angry travelers are visible, burned-out frontline workers are visible. Airport dysfunction is one of the fastest ways for a budget fight in Washington to become a national public backlash. That pressure had already been building, and the White House clearly understood that. Trump signed a directive to ensure TSA workers would be paid even while Congress remains stuck over the larger DHES bill, and this is not happening in a vacuum. The broader shutdown fight is centered on immigration enforcement funding, especially over ICE and related border operations. The Senate moved to pass a bill that would fund most of DHES while leaving out some of the most politically explosive immigration pieces. But House Republicans rejected that approach, keeping the standoff alive. So what Trump just did was politically very specific. He removed one of the most painful and visible consequences of the fight without actually resolving the fight itself. That is where this gets much more interesting than a normal funding story. Because if you can reduce the public pain while keeping the political leverage, you change the entire battlefield. And that brings us to what actually happened. Trump instructed the government to pay TSA workers despite the ongoing shutdown-related funding standoff. According to multiple reports, DHES indicated those workers could start receiving pay quickly, potentially as soon as the next pay cycle. The practical goal is obvious: stop the airport situation from spiraling further while Congress keeps fighting. That move came at almost the exact same moment the Senate tried to create an off-ramp. Senators pushed through a measure to fund most of DHES, including agencies and functions directly tied to public-facing disruption, but not the full immigration enforcement package many House Republicans want. The House rejected it. That matters, because it means there was a legislative path to ease the crisis, and it still collapsed under the weight of the immigration fight. So if you zoom out, the sequence is extremely telling. Congress failed to settle the larger dispute, the Senate tried a partial fix. The House refused it, and Trump stepped in to neutralize the part of the crisis most likely to hurt politically. That is not random, that is message management. But here's the part almost nobody is talking about. Paying TSA workers does not mean the shutdown fight is under control. It means one politically dangerous symptom is being isolated. That is a huge difference. Because the public often judges a crisis based on what they can see. If airport lines improve, if fewer travelers are stuck, if fewer headlines show exhausted TSA officers working without pay, then one of the most emotionally powerful symbols of dysfunction starts to fade. And once that happens, the pressure on Congress changes too. That may be exactly the point. TSA was becoming the weak spot in the entire shutdown fight. Travel groups were already warning Congress that forcing airport security workers to keep working under unstable pay conditions was reckless and unsustainable. That kind of pressure matters because it turns a policy fight into a competence test. Once ordinary Americans start feeling disorder in airports, the political cost rises fast. and Trump appears to have decided that this specific cost was not worth paying. Now, strategically, that creates a very different kind of conflict. Because if TSA gets paid, the pressure shifts away from transportation chaos and back toward the deeper issue, immigration enforcement and border policy. That is where Republicans, especially House hardliners, want the fight to stay. They do not want this argument to be mainly about airport lines. They want it to be about ICE deportation, operations, border authority, and the broader ideological question of how much power and funding immigration agencies should have. That is the real battlefield. And once TSA is politically insulated, that battlefield becomes easier to hold. Now this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Trump's move can be read into completely different ways, and both interpretations matter. The first reading is the obvious one. He's protecting essential workers and trying to prevent unnecessary public disruption. That is the cleaner political message, and it will likely resonate with a lot of voters who simply think TSA workers should never have been caught in this in the first place. But the second reading is more revealing. He may also be trying to keep the shutdown politically sustainable. That sounds harsh, but think it through. If the worst visible consequences disappear, then the broader standoff can continue longer without producing the same public backlash. In other words, paying TSA workers may not be a sign that the crisis is ending. It may be a sign that the administration is making the crisis easier to carry. And if that is true, then this was not just a worker protection move. It was a political stabilization move that matters because shutdown fights are usually won or lost through pain distribution. Who feels it first? Who gets blamed first? Who can survive it longer? That is often more important than the actual legislative text, and by protecting TSA, Trump may have just reshaped the pain map, and what happened next changed the entire calculation, because once TSA is carved out, the remaining shutdown pressure becomes less broad and more selective. That means the fight can narrow around agencies and functions that many voters do not see every day, even though they are critically important. FEMA, cybersecurity operations, administrative support, and parts of the larger homeland infrastructure can still face strain even if the airport crisis cools down. The danger there is obvious. Washington may start acting as if the emergency is over simply because the most visible inconvenience is less severe, and that is a very American political pattern. If the cameras stop showing the problem, leaders start acting like the problem has been solved. But operationally, that is not how government works. You can't run a department as large and sensitive as DHS by permanently patching over only the most politically painful pieces. At some point, the underlying funding structure still matters. At some point, morale still matters. At some point, staffing, retention, readiness, and long-term planning all begin to break down under uncertainty. That is why this story is bigger than TSA paychecks. It's about whether the U.S. government is now entering a phase where visible state functions are selectively protected for political reasons while deeper institutional damage is allowed to continue in the background. And if that sounds dramatic, it shouldn't. That is already how a lot of modern politics works. Stabilize the optics. Manage the public pain. Keep the core conflict alive. That is a very different model from actually governing your way out of a crisis, and this could have real consequences beyond Washington. In the short term, if airport operations improve, markets and the public may read that as a sign of calm, but if the deeper DHS funding battle remains unresolved, that calm is fragile. You still have uncertainty around federal operations, national security planning, immigration enforcement policy, and the basic ability of Congress to fund critical agencies cleanly. Internationally, allies also watch these moments more closely than people think. When America cannot resolve a homeland funding fight without executive improvisation and legislative paralysis, it raises questions about reliability, coordination, and institutional strength, not because the country is collapsing, it's not, but because repeated dysfunction chips away at credibility, especially when the agencies involved touch border policy, aviation security, and emergency response, and politically here at home, this may become a test of what voters actually punish. Do they punish visible inconvenience? Or do they punish prolonged dysfunction even after the inconvenience gets partially masked? That is the real question now, because if the public only reacts when the airport line gets unbearable, then Washington learns the wrong lesson. It learns that dysfunction is manageable as long as the optics are controlled, and that would be a very dangerous incentive going forward, which brings us back to the promise at the beginning. The biggest insight in this story is not simply that Trump ordered TSA workers to be paid, it's why that move matters so much. He didn't solve the shutdown fight. He changed which part of the shutdown the country is most likely to notice. That is a very different thing. And once you understand that, the whole story becomes clearer. This is not just about protecting workers, though it does do that. It is also about protecting political positioning. It is about removing the most visible source of public anger while keeping the larger immigration and border funding fight alive on terms that are more favorable to the White House and House Republicans. That is the deeper game here. And whether you support Trump or not, that is the strategic reality people should understand, because if Washington can now selectively reduce the pain without solving the problem, we are going to see more of this, not less. More partial fixes, more controlled dysfunction, more political fights where the public sees only the cleaned up version of a much bigger institutional breakdown. And that is what makes this story important, not just for this week, but for how American government may be run from crisis to crisis going forward. If you want more clear, independent political analysis without the cable news noise, subscribe now, and I want your honest take in the comments. Do you think Trump's move was mainly about protecting workers, or mainly about protecting the politics of the shutdown fight? Drop your answer below, and if you know someone who follows U.S. politics closely, share this with them, because this story says a lot about where Washington is heading next.